Sometimes a broken cabin is not a ruin at all, but the last place a man can still hear his own heart speak. Daniel Cooper stood at the edge of the forest with the late afternoon light slanting through the bare trees, his boots pressed into a thin layer of frost, his breath slow and white in the cold air as if the season itself had asked him to move quietly. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered and weathered in the way only veteran stories can make a man, with a square face, short dark brown hair touched with silver at the temples, and a faint stubble that never quite disappeared from his jaw. He wore a faded olive jacket over a plain gray sweatshirt, dark jeans worn pale at the knees, and heavy work boots marked by years of long roads and hard days. His expression carried the kind of stillness that comes from surviving too much while saying too little. At his side moved Duke, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a silver gray and cream coat, amber eyes bright and steady, ears high and alert, a quiet presence that never asked Daniel to explain the things he had buried inside. The cabin stood ahead of them at the end of a narrow dirt path, half hidden by pines and winter brush, its weathered boards dark with age, its roof sagging just enough to look tired, its porch leaning into the cold as though it had been waiting longer than anyone should have to wait. Daniel paused before the door and looked at the paper in his hand one more time, the legal notice from his late brother folded at the creases, the ink softened by being carried too long in a pocket. He had not expected anything when the call came. Not comfort. Not answers. Not a place to belong. His brother had been gone for months, and what remained was a cabin that looked as if it had been left behind by time itself. Yet there was something in the way the note had been written, something in the steadiness of the last line, that had pulled Daniel across state lines and back into the woods like a thread he could not ignore. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, and the cabin answered with a low wooden sigh. Inside, the air was cold but not empty. It smelled of old cedar, dry paper, and the faint memory of smoke that had once clung to the beams. Sunlight slipped through the dusty windows in long golden ribbons, catching on a chipped mug by the sink, a wool blanket folded over the back of a chair, and a coat hook still holding a dark flannel shirt as though the person who wore it might return at any moment. Daniel stood very still in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, his eyes moving slowly over the room. A narrow table sat near the stove. A stack of unopened mail rested beside a lantern. The floorboards creaked under his weight with a tired kind of honesty. Duke entered first, nose low, tail calm, moving room to room as if reading the shape of the past in the corners of the floor. The dog stopped near the old cast-iron stove, then turned his head toward the back wall and stared at it for a long second. Daniel followed that look, then frowned, because there was nothing there except peeling paint, a cracked shelf, and the shadow of the afternoon. But Duke had already stepped forward, pressing his nose to the baseboard, inhaling once, then again, with the focused certainty that Daniel had learned to trust more than his own instincts. When Duke began to paw gently at the floor near the stove, Daniel crouched beside him and ran his fingers along the wood. One board felt looser than the others, a little hollow beneath his touch, almost like a secret trying not to be found. Daniel exhaled and looked around the cabin again, the silence deepening around him, not heavy now but watchful. The late light touched the room in warm amber tones, turning the dust in the air into tiny floating sparks, and for a moment the old cabin no longer felt broken. It felt deliberate. It felt like a place that had been left imperfect on purpose, waiting for the right hands, the right heart, and the right dog to discover that something beneath the surface was still alive. Daniel rested one hand on Duke's back and felt the steady warmth beneath the fur, then lowered his gaze to the loose board and the faint seam in the floor beside it. He did not know yet what his brother had hidden here, or why the cabin had been left in this state, but he knew with the quiet certainty of veteran stories that the past never leaves a man empty without also leaving behind the beginning of an answer. And as the wind moved softly through the pines outside, Daniel knelt beside the stove, placed his fingers under the edge of the board, and began to lift. Daniel slid his fingers beneath the edge of the loose board and lifted slowly, the old wood giving way with a soft, aching creak that seemed to travel through the whole cabin. Duke stepped back just enough to watch, his amber eyes steady, his ears forward, his body still with that unusual kind of focus that made Daniel trust every instinct the dog carried. Beneath the board was a shallow space lined with dust and a small metal tin wrapped in oilcloth, the kind of thing a man could hide for years and still find exactly where he left it if he had written the world carefully enough in his mind. Daniel reached in and pulled it free with both hands, setting it on the floorboards beside him as the afternoon light from the window stretched across the cabin and caught the edges of the tin in a soft golden glow. For a moment he did not open it. He just stared at it, feeling the strange weight of it in the room, as though his brother had not simply left him a cabin but had arranged this exact silence so Daniel would have to decide what to do with it. Duke lowered his head and nudged the tin once with the tip of his nose, then looked up at Daniel as if to say that the waiting was over. Daniel gave the smallest nod and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 folded letters tied with twine, a small brass key, and a map drawn by hand on yellowed paper. The map showed the cabin, the surrounding trees, and a narrow trail marked in dark ink that led farther back into the woods, beyond where Daniel had walked since arriving. At the bottom of the page, in his brother's familiar handwriting, was a sentence so simple that it made Daniel inhale sharply, "Follow where he digs." Daniel looked at Duke, then back at the map, and for the first time since stepping into the cabin he felt the room shift around a question larger than grief. He unfolded the first letter with careful fingers. The paper was worn soft at the folds, and the words inside were written in a hand that was steady, patient, and deeply personal, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who had thought long and hard about what he wanted to leave behind. His brother wrote that the cabin had not always been broken. Years ago, it had been a place to store tools, keep dry food, and sit through winter storms with the stove burning low. But there was more to the land than the cabin itself. There was a section of ground behind the trees where the soil had once shifted after a heavy thaw, revealing a hidden place under the roots. His brother had never told anyone, not because he wanted to keep a secret for its own sake, but because some things were safer when only one person knew where to find them. Daniel read that line twice. Then he continued. The letter explained that the cabin had been left to him not as a burden, but as a beginning. His brother knew Daniel had spent too many years moving from one hard season to the next, carrying too much without asking for anything back. He wrote that he hoped Daniel would stay long enough to hear the quiet of the place, long enough to understand that a broken roof and a tired floor did not mean the end of a home. It only meant there was work to be done. Daniel lowered the letter slowly and sat back on his heels, the cabin around him suddenly fuller than before. The cracked window, the cold stove, the worn chair by the wall, the coat on the hook, the dust on the shelf, all of it seemed to be part of a story he had not known he was already inside. Duke circled once near the back door and then stopped, turning his head toward the trees outside with the same alert interest he had shown at the floorboard. Daniel rose and looked through the glass. Beyond the porch, the woods stood quiet and deep, trunks rising like dark pillars under the pale winter sky. The map in his hand seemed to pulse with direction. He pressed the brass key between his fingers and felt its weight, small but certain. Then he noticed something he had missed before. Near the back of the cabin, half hidden by stacked firewood and a sagging crate, was a narrow patch of earth where the snow had not settled evenly. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but the ground looked disturbed in the way only a dog would notice first and a man would understand second. Duke was already there, nose close to the floor, tail low and purposeful, his body angled toward the back door as if he had made up his mind before Daniel ever did. Daniel folded the letter, tucked it into his jacket, and stepped toward the door. The cabin behind him was still cold and broken, but now it was no longer silent in the way of abandonment. It was silent in the way of anticipation. He turned the key in his hand once, then opened the door and let the crisp winter air rush in, carrying the smell of pine, frost, and something old beneath the ground, waiting patiently for the right hands to uncover it. Daniel stepped out onto the back porch with the brass key in one hand and Duke close at his side, the winter air touching his face with the clean, sharp quiet of a morning that had not yet decided what it would become. The woods behind the cabin stretched out in a deep wash of pine and pale light, the ground lined with frost, the branches still impatient above him. For a long moment he simply stood there, listening. The cabin behind him creaked softly in the cold, and somewhere farther off a crow called once from the trees, the sound carrying through the open space like a thought he could not quite catch. Daniel looked down at the map again, then toward the narrow strip of disturbed earth near the back steps. It was not a dramatic thing. Nothing about it shouted for attention. But Duke had already made his opinion clear. The dog moved toward the patch of ground, lowered his nose, and began to dig with steady purpose, pulling at the frozen soil with his front paws until small clumps of dirt and pine needles scattered across the snow. Daniel watched him for a few seconds, then knelt beside the spot and pressed the key between his fingers as if trying to imagine what his brother had seen when he drew the map. The ground was harder than it looked, packed with the memory of cold nights and seasons of weather. Daniel set the key aside, rolled up his sleeves, and helped Duke clear the dirt. The work was quiet and slow, the kind of work that let a man think without having to speak. After a few minutes, the shovel he found near the woodpile struck something solid beneath the shallow layer of earth. He froze, then brushed away the loose soil with his hands. A flat wooden cover appeared, old and weathered, fitted into the ground so neatly that it had nearly disappeared into the earth itself. Daniel stared at it for a second before looking at Duke. The dog sat back on his haunches, ears high, eyes bright, as if this was the part he had been waiting for. Daniel slipped the brass key into the small metal lock on the cover. It turned with a soft click that sounded far louder in the stillness than it should have. He lifted the lid slowly, and a breath of cool, damp air rose from below, carrying the scent of pine roots, old wood, and something faintly metallic that belonged to forgotten things. Beneath the hatch was a narrow stone-lined space, no bigger than a small closet, tucked into the ground just beyond the cabin wall. Sunlight reached only the top edge, so Daniel took the lantern from inside and lowered it carefully until the warm glow touched the walls. Inside were 2 weatherproof boxes, a folded wool blanket, a tin lunch pail, and a leather satchel that looked older than the rest. Daniel reached down and lifted the satchel first. It was heavier than he expected. When he set it beside him and opened the clasp, he found a bundle of letters tied with blue string, a small set of photographs, and a second envelope marked with his name. The handwriting was his brother's again, the same strong and careful script, but this letter was longer, written as if the man had needed to say more than the first page could hold. Daniel unfolded it and began to read while Duke stayed near his knee, the dog so still that even the frost seemed to pause around them. His brother wrote about the years they had spent apart, about the silence between calls, about how life had a way of making brothers feel farther away than miles ever could. He wrote that the cabin had been his attempt to leave something honest behind, something that did not disappear when a man was gone. The hidden space under the ground had once been used during hard winters, then later as a place to keep family keepsakes dry and safe, but over time it became more than storage. It became proof. Proof that a home could hold grief without surrendering to it. Proof that a broken life could still make room for mercy. Daniel read those lines twice, then lowered the page and looked at the photographs spread on the dirt beside him. There were images of both brothers as boys standing in front of a lake, one with a fishing pole and the other with a crooked smile. There was a picture of their mother in a porch chair with a pie resting on her lap, and there was one of the cabin in better days, smoke rising from the chimney while winter light fell across the roof. Daniel felt something inside his chest give way, not all at once, but gently, like ice loosening under the first warm sun of spring. Duke pressed closer then, leaning his weight against Daniel's leg, and Daniel lowered a hand to rest on the dog's head. He sat there on the edge of the open hatch, the cabin above him, the woods all around him, and the letter in his lap, and for the first time since he had received the call, he understood that his brother had not left him a broken place to fix alone. He had left him a path. A small, hidden path beneath the roots of the cabin, leading not to riches, but to remembrance, to purpose, to the quiet kind of healing that only comes when a man finally stops trying to outrun what he has lost. Daniel looked once more into the little chamber in the ground, then back at the cabin wall, where the afternoon light now slipped across the old boards in a warm golden strip. The cabin was still rough, still old, still worn by time, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt prepared. It felt like the beginning of something the woods had been protecting all along. Daniel folded the letter carefully and stood, the brass key warm in his palm, while Duke rose with him and turned toward the trees as if already listening to the next part of the story. By the time Daniel climbed back out of the hidden chamber beneath the cabin, the afternoon had slipped farther toward evening, and the forest had changed its color from pale winter silver to a deeper, softer blue. He stood on the back porch for a moment with the folded letter in one hand and the brass key in the other, letting the cold air touch his face while Duke circled once at his feet and then sat, looking out toward the trees as if he, too, understood that something important had finally been uncovered. The cabin behind them seemed quieter now, not because it had grown empty, but because it no longer needed to keep its secret locked away. Daniel looked at the woods and then at the narrow path beyond the porch, the one marked in his brother's map, and after a long breath he made the decision to follow it. He pulled his jacket tighter, tucked the letter safely inside, and stepped off the porch with Duke walking close beside him. The path behind the cabin was narrow and half hidden beneath pine needles and frozen leaves, the ground soft in some places and hard in others, as if the forest had spent years learning how to keep this place from being seen. Old roots crossed the trail like dark veins beneath the snow, and thin branches brushed Daniel's sleeves as he moved deeper into the trees. The world here felt different from the front of the cabin. It was more enclosed, more patient, more intimate, as if the woods had narrowed to make room for memory. Duke led without hurry, nose low, pausing every few steps to check the ground, then lifting his head whenever he sensed Daniel lagging behind. Daniel followed the route marked on the map, the brass key still warm from his hand, until the path opened into a small clearing behind a stand of tall pines. At first glance it looked like nothing more than a forgotten patch of earth, a place where the snow had settled unevenly and the brush had grown wild. But Duke stopped at once and began to dig again, this time near the base of a fallen log coated in moss and frost. Daniel frowned, then crouched beside him and brushed away the debris with both hands. Beneath the surface, a flat stone slab emerged, dark with age and fitted into the ground so neatly it might have been there since the forest was first mapped. Daniel laid the lantern on the snow, knelt carefully, and pressed his fingers along the edges of the slab until he found a small iron ring hidden in the corner. He pulled upward. The stone lifted slowly with a deep, rough scrape, and beneath it was a narrow chamber built into the earth, lined with old timber and dry despite the frozen ground above. The lantern light reached only partway inside, but that was enough for Daniel to see a stack of weathered boxes, several wrapped bundles, and a wooden crate stamped with faded black letters. Duke stepped back but remained alert, his ears high, his eyes locked on the opening as though guarding it from the cold. Daniel lowered himself onto one knee and reached in. The first box he opened held family keepsakes, a folded quilt, a pocket watch that no longer ticked, a bundle of postcards, and a pair of photographs tied with string. In one picture, Daniel and his brother stood beside a truck in front of the cabin years earlier, both younger, both laughing at something just outside the frame. In another, their late father stood on the porch with a coffee mug in one hand and a tired but peaceful expression on his face. Daniel lingered on that photograph longer than the others. It was the kind of image that did not need words to carry weight. It simply reminded him that a house and a family can both hold more silence than a man knows how to name. Beneath the keepsakes was the crate with the faded lettering. Daniel wiped the dust from the top and read the words slowly in the lantern glow: supplies, winter, do not move. He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, except there was no humor in it, only the quiet astonishment of realizing his brother had not merely hidden a few objects under the forest floor. He had prepared for seasons. The crate held canned food, sealed water bottles, extra lantern oil, blankets, matches, batteries, and a neat stack of notebooks with weather notes, repair lists, and names written in the margins. It looked less like a stash and more like a long act of care. Daniel's throat tightened as he turned one of the notebooks open. The pages held brief entries about storms, cabin repairs, a neighbor who needed firewood, a man passing through with no place to stay, and an older woman who had left a jar of jam on the porch in return for a warm meal. The writing was plain, but the pattern underneath it was impossible to ignore. His brother had lived here not simply to survive, but to practice being useful. To make room for people. To leave behind a place where no one would have to prove they deserved shelter. Daniel sat back on his heels, the notebook open in his lap, and the deeper winter light filtered through the trees around him like a hush. The clearing felt strangely alive, as if the ground itself knew it had been opened after years of waiting. Duke came close then and rested his head lightly against Daniel's knee. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's neck and let the warmth there steady him. He thought about all the years he had spent moving from one hard day to the next, carrying loss like a tool he could never put down. He thought about how easy it had been to believe that his brother's last gift would be something broken because broken things were all Daniel had learned to expect. But this was not a broken gift. It was a way forward. A hidden chamber in the cold earth. A cabin with a tired roof and a stubborn stove. A map, a key, a dog who dug where he was meant to dig. And more than any of it, a message written between the lines of everything his brother had left behind, that a man can still inherit purpose after grief, still inherit home after wandering, still inherit a future even when he has forgotten how to ask for one. Daniel closed the notebook and looked once more at the crate, the photographs, the weathered boards around the chamber, and the forest that had guarded it all with such quiet patience. Then he lifted the lantern, rose to his feet, and told Duke in a voice softened by the cold and by something gentler than grief, "Let us see what else he left for us." Daniel climbed out of the chamber in the clearing with the lantern in one hand and the notebook in the other, while Duke followed close behind with the kind of quiet patience that came only from trust built over time. The winter light had shifted again, now lower and softer, turning the needles on the pines into threads of gold against the blue shadow of the woods. For a few minutes Daniel simply stood there with the cold air touching his face, listening to the forest the way his brother must have listened to it for years. Nothing moved except the faint drift of breath from his mouth and the slow turn of Duke's head as the dog scanned the trees with calm attention. Then Daniel looked back at the chamber and understood that what he had found under the ground was not a storage space in the usual sense. It was a record. A quiet, practical record of a life built around remembering people. He returned the stone slab to its place, then led Duke back toward the cabin along the narrow path, the lantern swinging low and warm beside his leg. The old cabin appeared between the trees like a patient face in the fading light, its sagging porch and weathered boards no longer looking simply broken, but waiting to be answered. Daniel stepped inside and set the lantern on the table near the stove. The room glowed at once with amber warmth, and the dust in the air softened into floating sparks. He opened the notebook again beside the stove and read the entries more carefully this time. The pages were full of practical notes, but they also held something gentler beneath the ink. One line described how much wood to keep dry beside the back wall in case the road froze over. Another named a man from the neighboring valley who had once arrived after dark and left with a warm meal and a blanket. Another mentioned a mother and child who had stayed through a storm while the cabin's roof groaned overhead. Daniel looked up from the page and let the words sit in the room around him. The cabin had not merely sheltered his brother. It had sheltered others too. It had become a place where the tired could stop, where the lost could breathe, where no one had to explain why they were cold or why they had come with empty hands. Duke circled the stove once and then settled beside it, his body curling into the warm patch of floor as though he already understood that this place was becoming theirs now. Daniel reached into the satchel again and found a second notebook, thinner than the first, its cover lined in old black cloth. Inside were pages of hand-drawn diagrams, measurements, and repair sketches. The drawings showed the cabin walls, the stove, the roofline, and the hidden chamber below, but there were also notes about how the porch could be strengthened, how the back room might be insulated, and how the loft could be made usable again. At the bottom of one page, his brother had written a simple sentence that made Daniel pause for a long time: "It is easier to be kind when the house is not leaking." Daniel stared at that line and felt something shift in him, subtle but clear. His brother had not been dreaming about a perfect place. He had been building one honest enough to serve people in real weather. He had looked at a broken cabin and seen not failure, but potential. Not a burden, but a beginning. Daniel set the notebook down and walked to the front window. Outside, the sky had deepened into a clean winter blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear above the trees. The forest stood still around the cabin, tall and dark, holding the day in silence. For a moment Daniel sought his own reflection in the glass, a man with tired eyes and a face made rough by years of carrying more than he spoke about. He did not look defeated there. He looked like someone being asked to stay. Duke lifted his head from near the stove and watched him, ears pricked, tail resting still on the floor. Daniel crossed the room, picked up the photographs from the satchel, and spread them gently across the table. He studied each one again, but this time they did not feel like artifacts from a life he had missed. They felt like directions. In one, his brother stood beside the cabin with a hammer in his hand, sunlight touching his shoulders. In another, a neighbor woman held a basket of vegetables and smiled toward the porch. In a third, a child sat on the steps with a dog almost exactly the size Duke had once been years ago. Daniel looked at that picture, then at Duke, and almost smiled for the first time since arriving. It occurred to him that his brother had understood him in a way Daniel had never allowed himself to admit. He had known Daniel would not arrive looking for wealth. He had known Daniel would need a reason to remain. A place to fix. A place to guard. A place to let the quiet become useful instead of empty. Daniel folded the photographs carefully and placed them back in the satchel. Then he walked to the stove, added another log, and watched the flame rise with a low orange pulse. The cabin answered with a soft crackle, then a deeper warmth that spread slowly through the room. He listened to the sound and thought of all the years he had lived as if every ending was only a closed door. But here, in this old cabin at the edge of the trees, nothing felt closed. The floorboards were still worn. The roof still leaned. The boards still needed work. Yet the house was alive in the oldest and truest way a home can be alive, by being ready for the next person in need. Daniel rested one hand on Duke's head and looked around the room one more time, at the stove, the lantern, the notes, the weathered walls, the quiet dog, and the snow gathering softly outside the windows. Then he opened the notebook to the next page and began making his own list, writing carefully in the margin beside his brother's words, knowing that the story had not ended when the cabin was inherited. It had only just begun. Daniel wrote for several minutes in silence, the point of his pen moving slowly across the paper beside his brother's notes, his own words smaller, less certain at first, then steadier as the list grew. Wood for the porch. Nails. New hinges. Patch the roof near the chimney. Clean the chimney before the next storm. Insulate the back room. Fix the broken latch on the front door. Leave space by the stove for anyone who arrives late. He paused after that last line and stared at it for a long moment, the cabin warm around him now, the fire turning soft in the stove, Duke curled at his feet like a dark and silver shadow with a heartbeat. The winter night pressed gently against the windows, but inside the room the light had changed everything. The old cabin still looked tired, still bore its age in every board and beam, yet Daniel no longer saw ruin when he looked around. He saw work. He saw intention. He saw a place that had already begun teaching him how to stay. By the next morning, a thin white frost had formed along the window frames, and the forest beyond the cabin looked almost painted in layers of blue and silver. Daniel woke early to the quiet, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty when a man has spent enough of his life learning the difference. He stood by the stove in his sweatshirt and socks, shoulders relaxing slowly as the warmth returned to his hands, then opened the notebook again and studied the repair sketches his brother had left behind. The drawings were careful, practical, almost stubborn in their detail. Measurements for the porch rails. Notes on replacing the broken section of roof. A small diagram for reinforcing the back wall. Directions for sealing the floor near the hidden chamber so the cold would not rise through the boards. It was the language of a man who had built his life from usefulness, one honest repair at a time. Daniel put the notebook down, looked out the window, and then turned to Duke, who was sitting upright near the door with the stillness of a guard waiting for orders. "We start today," Daniel said quietly, and Duke answered with one short wag of his tail, as if that was all the agreement they needed. The morning work began with simple things. Daniel carried the old rug outside and shook the dust from it against the porch rail, then swept the floorboards from the stove to the back wall. He brought in dry wood from the stack near the side of the cabin and set it close to the fire. He found a loose nail in the front step and pressed it back into place with the heel of his palm. The work was not dramatic. It did not ask to be admired. But veteran stories are often built out of exactly this kind of work, the kind that looks small from far away and means everything up close. Duke stayed near him the whole time, occasionally wandering to the edge of the woods and then returning with a nose full of pine needles, as if checking the perimeter of the world itself. By late morning, Daniel had climbed onto a low ladder to inspect the broken section of roof above the front door. From that angle he could see how the shingles had curled with age, how the trim had split at one corner, and how sunlight came through a thin gap near the chimney to strike the dust inside the cabin in bright floating threads. He stood there a while, the wind brushing his face, and thought about his brother working under the same roof in colder weather, making lists, fixing what he could, leaving clues for a man who had not yet arrived. That thought settled in his chest with a strange tenderness. Daniel did not feel rushed anymore. He felt included. When he came back down from the ladder, he set to work on the front latch, using the brass key as a makeshift tool to loosen a stubborn screw. The cabin door shut more cleanly after that, the frame no longer catching in the cold. It was such a small sound, the soft click of a repaired latch, but it made Daniel pause and listen. The cabin answered with a deeper hush, as if pleased to be treated carefully at last. Inside, the stove ticked gently as the fire burned low and even. Outside, snow began to drift again in slow, weightless flakes that gathered on the porch rail and the path beyond. Daniel moved to the table and turned the page in the notebook, only to discover a new section at the bottom that he had not seen the night before. It was not a repair note. It was a list of names. A neighbor woman from the hill road. A retired mechanic in the valley. A young father with no heat after a storm. A widow who came with a basket of peaches in summer and left with extra blankets in winter. Beneath the names was one final sentence written in the same steady hand: "The cabin has always done better when it remembers other people." Daniel read it twice, then lowered the page and let out a breath that felt like both grief and gratitude. He understood then what his brother had been doing all along. The cabin was never meant to be a private hiding place. It was meant to be a threshold. A place where the tired could stop, where the forgotten could be seen, where a veteran and his dog could offer shelter without needing to call it noble. The thought moved through him slowly, opening space where Strain had lived for years. That afternoon, Daniel took the lantern from the hidden chamber and placed it in the front window, though the day was still bright. He wanted the cabin to look alive from the road, wanted anyone passing through to know there was light inside. Duke watched him do it, head tilted, then walked to the porch and sat facing the trees as if he had taken up his post. Daniel stood beside the window and looked out at the pale winter woods, the tiny flakes of snow, the old path disappearing into the pines. For the first time since arriving, he imagined someone else walking that path one day, tired and cold, and finding the cabin open. He imagined the stove warm, the porch repaired, the door easy to close and easier to open. He imagined what it would mean to keep that promise. And in that quiet room, with Duke nearby and the fire breathing softly in the stove, Daniel realized that the life his brother had left him was not waiting beneath the floorboards or inside the hidden chamber anymore. It was already here, growing in the light. By the time the seventh night arrived, the cabin no longer felt like a place Daniel was merely occupying. It felt lived in, warmed by small routines, shaped by steady hands, and touched by the quiet rhythm of a life slowly returning to itself. The stove gave off an even heat that moved softly through the rooms, the lantern in the front window cast a steady amber glow across the porch, and Duke had claimed a spot near the fire where he could watch both the door and Daniel at the same time. Outside, the forest stood wrapped in a pale winter calm, the trees dark against the snow, their branches carrying a thin silver edge where moonlight touched them. Daniel had spent the day finishing the roof patch above the front door and replacing the broken latch on the back window, and now he sat at the table with the notebook open beside him, reading the names again as the evening settled around the cabin. The list was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a map of the kind of man his brother had been. Not loud. Not grand. Just faithful in the small places where kindness is often forgotten. Daniel was tracing one of the names with his finger when Duke lifted his head and gave a quiet, deliberate bark toward the porch. It was not the kind of bark that meant danger. It was the kind that meant someone was near. Daniel looked up at once, the chair scraping softly under him as he stood. Through the frosted glass of the window he saw a shape moving at the edge of the path, hesitant and slow, bundled in a dark coat against the cold. He stepped to the door, opened it, and found a woman standing there with red cheeks from the wind and a basket covered in a wool cloth balanced carefully in both hands. She looked to be in her 60s, her gray hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, her eyes tired in the way of someone who had known too many winters alone. "I hope I am not intruding," she said gently. "I am Nora Whitcomb. I live 2 bends down the road." Daniel recognized the name from the notebook before she even said another word. He glanced down at the list on the table and then back at her, and Nora gave a small smile as if she had read his expression before he could hide it. "Your brother helped my husband and me more than once," she said. "He never made a show of it. Just fixed what needed fixing and left before anyone could thank him properly." Daniel opened the door wider and invited her in. Duke approached first, sniffed the basket, then sat back with calm approval. Nora stepped into the warmth and looked around the cabin with soft recognition. "It has changed," she said quietly. "Not the boards. The feeling." Daniel did not answer at first. He set the basket on the table and lifted the cloth to reveal a loaf of bread, a jar of blackberry jam, and a small tin of butter wrapped in wax paper. The smell alone seemed to brighten the room. Nora removed her coat and sat by the stove while Daniel put water on to heat. The conversation that followed was simple and slow, the way the best conversations often are in veteran stories. She told him that his brother had kept the cabin a place of quiet refuge for years. She told him about the storm in February when the road had frozen shut and the cabin lights stayed on late into the night for a family stranded with no place else to go. She told him about the summer afternoon when a young boy had followed Duke to the porch and ended up eating soup at the table because his mother had been working 2 jobs and could not get him home until dark. Daniel listened without interrupting, the words settling into him with the weight of something true. He had known his brother had hidden supplies below the floor, had known the cabin had been used for more than one purpose, but hearing it spoken aloud gave the place a new shape. It was not just a home left behind. It was a pattern of care. Nora noticed the notebook on the table and reached toward it, stopping only long enough to ask, "May I?" Daniel nodded. She turned a page, smiled to herself, and said, "He wrote everything down, did he not?" Daniel almost laughed at that, because it sounded exactly like the kind of thing his brother would do. Meticulous where it mattered. Quiet where it was kind. Duke rested near Nora's feet now, his tail thumping once when she reached down to scratch behind his ears. She looked at him fondly. "That dog of yours has the same patient eyes your brother used to say belonged to the best kind of guide." Daniel looked at Duke and felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the stove. Nora stayed until the kettle whistled and the cabin filled with the smell of tea and bread and melted butter. Together they sat at the table, eating in a soft silence that felt more companionable than empty, and through the window Daniel could see snow beginning to fall again in slow, careful flakes. They passed the jam between them, and Nora told him one last thing before she stood to leave. "Your brother said this place would one day belong to someone who understood that shelter is not only a roof. It is a promise." After she left, Daniel remained at the door for a long time, watching her walk down the path with the basket under her arm, her figure shrinking into the white dusk until the trees took her from view. Duke came and stood beside him, shoulder against his leg, and together they looked out at the lantern glowing in the front window. The cabin no longer felt like an inheritance hidden beneath wood and earth. It felt like a hand extended across time. Daniel closed the door, turned back toward the warm room, and understood that the work of healing was no longer about uncovering what his brother had left behind. It was about becoming the kind of man who could keep it alive. The following morning arrived pale and quiet, with a thin wash of winter light settling over the cabin roofs and the woods beyond them like a soft veil. Daniel woke before the stove had gone cold, sitting up slowly under the blanket with Duke already awake beside the fire, his ears turned toward the window as if he had been listening to the forest long before sunrise. The cabin felt different now. Not larger, not newer, but deeper somehow, as if every repaired latch, every stacked log, every page in the notebook had added another layer of belonging. Daniel stood at the window with a mug of coffee in both hands and watched the snow drift in slow, light flakes across the path. Nora had left the night before, but her words had stayed behind him like warmth in the walls. Shelter is not only a roof. It is a promise. He had repeated that line more than once while lying awake, and now it seemed to fit the cabin better than anything his brother had ever written in the notebook. By mid-morning, Daniel was already outside with a hammer in one hand and a box of nails in the other, tightening the last loose board on the porch rail. The work had become a rhythm for him. Not a burden. Not a performance. A rhythm. Duke moved in and out of the open doorway, checking the edge of the porch, then returning to Daniel's side with the calm focus of a dog who understood that the smallest repairs sometimes mattered most. Daniel leaned back to inspect the rail, then nodded once to himself and drove the final nail home. The sound rang clean in the cold air, and for a moment he simply stood there, listening to it fade into the woods. He had not realized how much he had been waiting for something as simple as a finished job to feel this satisfying. Inside, he found the notebook open where he had left it the night before. Nora had written her name beside one of the entries after reading it, and that small addition made Daniel smile with a kind of quiet surprise. He turned the page and saw more names, more dates, more little notes in his brother's steady hand. A neighbor with a broken heater. A truck stuck in the mud after spring thaw. A widow who came by for tea after the funeral and stayed long enough to laugh once before she left. Each line carried no drama at all, and yet together they formed a life far larger than the cabin itself. Daniel sat at the table and ran his finger beneath the entries, then slowly began making his own notes in the margins, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. He wrote down the size of the nails he had used on the porch. He wrote that the back room needed a second latch. He wrote that the woodpile should be moved closer to the kitchen entrance before the next snow. Then, after a pause, he wrote one more sentence beneath the rest, open when needed. Duke came to rest at his feet, settling in with a soft exhale that seemed to pull the silence deeper into the room without making it lonely. Daniel looked down at the dog and thought of all the times Duke had led him gently, from the loose floorboard to the hidden chamber, from the chamber to the clearing behind the cabin, from the clearing back to a life Daniel had almost let remain closed. Veteran stories often begin with hardship and loss, but Daniel was beginning to understand that the ending was never about being rescued from the past. It was about being taught how to use it. By noon, a pickup truck pulled slowly into the clearing and stopped near the path. Daniel stepped onto the porch and saw a man in a work coat getting out with a bundle of split firewood in the back of the truck. He recognized him from the notebook before the man even spoke. It was Eli Mercer, one of the names his brother had written in the margin. Eli was older, broad through the shoulders, with a cap pulled low and a face weathered by long seasons outdoors. He lifted a hand in greeting and called out, "I thought I would stop by before the snow gets worse." Daniel walked down the porch steps and met him halfway, and the two men shook hands as if they had known each other longer than a few minutes. Eli glanced at the cabin and then at Duke, who stood beside Daniel with bright, patient eyes. "Your brother told me this place would open again one day," Eli said. Daniel looked up at him, surprised, but Eli only shrugged and pointed toward the cabin. He had a way of seeing what most of us missed. Together they carried the firewood inside and stacked it near the stove. Eli helped tighten one of the back hinges while Daniel fetched tea. The cabin filled again with the smell of warm wood, coffee, and wet wool drying near the stove. When the work was done, Eli stood in the doorway and looked around with a kind of sober appreciation that Daniel recognized from his own reflection in the glass. "This is more than a cabin," Eli said quietly. "It is a place people can come to when they do not have anywhere else." Daniel did not answer right away. He watched Duke sit at the threshold, then looked at the lantern in the front window glowing softly even in the daylight. He thought of his brother writing names in the notebook, of Nora with her basket of bread, of all the small acts that had brought him to this exact afternoon. Then he nodded once and said, "That is what it is supposed to be." Eli smiled, touched the edge of his cap, and stepped back into the snow. After he left, Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time with Duke at his side, looking out at the path, the trees, the drifting flakes, and the light that had begun to gather in the window behind him. The cabin was still old. Still broken in places. Still in need of work. But now it had a purpose wide enough to hold more than grief. It had a future. And Daniel, standing there with the dog who had led him every step of the way, finally felt ready to keep it. The first real thaw of late winter arrived quietly, as if the season had chosen not to announce itself but to slip into the cabin gently and begin changing the world one soft degree at a time. Snow still rested in the shadows beneath the trees, but the path to the cabin had begun to show dark patches of earth, and the afternoon light felt less sharp than it had only a week before. Daniel stood on the porch with his hands resting on the rail he had repaired, looking out across the clearing while Duke sat beside him with his ears turned toward the wind. The cabin no longer looked like something left behind. It looked occupied. It looked ready. The lantern still glowed in the front window even in daylight, just enough to be seen from the road, just enough to say that someone was home. Inside, the stove gave off a steady warmth, the notebooks lay open on the table, and the smell of coffee drifted softly through the rooms. Daniel had spent the morning replacing a cracked board by the back step and bringing fresh water into the kitchen, the kind of work that would have once felt temporary and now felt like life itself. He had learned, slowly and almost without noticing, that healing often arrives through repetition. Through doing the same small acts well enough that they begin to feel like belonging. Duke had become part of that rhythm. Wherever Daniel went, the dog followed with calm certainty, checking the porch, the clearing, the woodpile, and the tree line as if each corner of the property mattered personally. When Daniel turned back inside, he found that he was no longer alone in the cabin the way he had been at the beginning of winter. Nora had come by earlier with a fresh loaf of bread and a jar of peach preserves, and Eli had stopped in the day before to bring a new hinge and leave a box of screws by the stove. They were not visitors now. They were part of the house's new breathing. Daniel looked at the notebook one more time and saw the list of names growing in the margins. Not just the old entries from his brother, but his own notes beside them, written in a hand that had grown steadier with each passing week. The cabin had become a place where people stopped in, shared a cup of tea, and left with more than they had come to ask for. A broken heater repaired before dark. A jar of soup on the porch. Firewood stacked against the wall. A widow who stayed long enough to laugh once. A truck driver who slept by the stove through a snow squall and left before dawn with warm hands and a grateful nod. Daniel had not planned any of this when he inherited the cabin. He had not expected a life to open from beneath a floorboard and grow upward into the light. But veteran stories often carry this kind of surprise. They begin in loss, travel through silence, and end by revealing that service is not something that ends when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it simply changes shape. Sometimes it becomes a porch light, a warm room, a repaired roof, a place where a stranger can finally sit down. By mid-afternoon, Daniel heard the sound of a vehicle easing to a stop near the path. He stepped outside and saw a woman with 2 children in the back seat and a bag of groceries in the front. She had the look of someone trying to hold too many things together at once, her face drawn by worry and cold. Daniel walked down the path to meet her, and she explained that her furnace had gone out the night before and the repair truck would not arrive until morning. It was Eli who had told her to come. Daniel did not hesitate. He waved her toward the cabin, and Duke greeted the children at once with a patient wag of his tail that made them smile despite the cold. They brought the children inside, and Daniel found blankets, tea, and a place for them near the stove. The cabin filled again with small sounds, a child asking about Duke, the clink of a cup on the table, the low hum of the fire, the soft creak of a door settling in the frame. Daniel watched the woman relax little by little as warmth returned to her hands and the children sat close to the stove with flushed cheeks and tired eyes. He saw then that the cabin had become exactly what his brother had tried to leave behind. Not a monument. Not a secret. A door that stayed open when people needed it most. When the family finally left after sunset, they did so with smiles that looked lighter than when they had arrived, and one of the children pressed a folded drawing into Daniel's hand before climbing into the truck. It showed a cabin with a lantern in the window and a dog sitting proudly at the porch. Daniel stood there after the taillights faded into the dark, holding the drawing while the last light bled from the sky. Duke came to stand beside him, shoulder warm against his leg, and together they watched the first stars appear above the trees. The snow was almost gone now except in the shaded places, and the air held that rare quiet that comes just before spring fully takes hold. Daniel looked back at the cabin, at the light in the window, at the repaired porch, at the wood stacked neatly beside the door, at the open notebook on the table inside. He thought about his brother, about the hidden chamber beneath the earth, about the map, the letters, the names, and the way Duke had begun the whole journey by digging where something needed to be found. He had started this winter believing he had inherited a broken cabin. He understood now that he had inherited a calling. He had inherited a chance to keep kindness alive in a place where it could grow. Daniel rested his hand on Duke's head and felt the dog lean into him with complete trust. Then, as the last light left the clearing and the lantern in the window began to shine brighter against the dark, Daniel smiled quietly and stepped inside, ready to keep the house open for whoever the road would bring next.